over and over again in satanic music and so forth. But even more importantly, in regard to the New Age movement, in the early 1900s, Aleister Crowley was talking about the new eon. Ionis is a Greek word for age, and the new eon being the new age. And what's interesting about Crowley's emphasis on the New Age, it had everything to do with what became popular in the 1960s.
In his shocking 10-hour documentary, They Sold Their Souls for Rock and Roll, Pastor Joe Schimmel exposes the role of music in furthering the New Age through the 1960s counterculture movement and reveals Aleister Crowley as the patron saint of rock musicians.
I can't think of any other occultist who's been more influential on rock musicians than Aleister Crowley, no one close. London Times called Crowley the unsung hero of the 1960s. In fact, if you look at the 1960s counterculture leaders, John Lennon, he said his whole philosophy was, and he quoting Aleister Crowley's axiom, do what thou wilt, was the whole Beatles philosophy, he said in his interviews before his death was do what thou willst. And they put their heroes up on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album, and who did they place there? Aleister Crowley. In fact, that whole album, as we show in our rockumentary, was basically a tribute to Crowley's New Eon, along with their Satanic Majesty's Request by the Stones that the Beatles put out with Sgt. Pepper. In fact, we make a really clear case for Sgt. Pepper being Crowley. In fact, Crowley died 20 years before that album came out, and of course the song 20 years ago today, Sgt. Pepper taught the band to play.
It was 20 years ago today, Sgt. Pepper taught the band to play.
It's quite interesting because not only was Lennon and the Beatles into Aleister Crowley, but we show the Rolling Stones and how they were into Crowley, and Mick Jagger and Keith Richards helping out with even Kenneth Anger's movies pushing Aleister Crowley's Satanism in Lucifer Rising and so forth. So you have the Stones, you have the Beatles, the two biggest rock bands of the 1960s. You have Jim Morrison with a bust of Aleister Crowley, the biggest American rock idol of the 60s, on his album 13. We can go on and on. Led Zeppelin, the biggest band of the 1970s. Jimmy Page buying Aleister Crowley's mansion overlooking Loch Ness, being full on into Aleister Crowley, using implements of his temple on the Presence album on the front cover, as Crowley talked about in his books on ritual magic, and even down to his symbol, Zoso, Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin, which is really soul, spelled forward, and soul spelled backwards, of the solar god. Soul was S-O-L, the god of, or Satan, in Crowley's books. It was another symbol of Satan, S-O-L. And that was Jimmy Page's occult symbol that he used that nobody could decipher. And recently in Rolling Stone magazine interview in 2002, they all came out and said what their symbol meant, except Page still wouldn't come out and say what his meant. But Crowley said to write backwards and forward. If you look at that symbol closely, it's soul, forward and backwards. So that's still not known to even the rock world what that symbol was, but Jimmy Page has admitted being an admirer of Crowley, practicing Crowley's magic for power and so forth, and they became very powerful. These bands sold their soul for rock and roll, so to speak.
This chilling song, performed by Crowley disciple Ozzy Osbourne, is said to reveal perhaps the darkest side of the New Age. In the latter half of the song, listen as Osbourne calls upon Crowley, known as the Great Beast, to ride his white horse. Schimmel and others believe this to be symbolic of the coming Antichrist, known as the first horseman of the apocalypse. In the book of Revelation we read, "And I saw, and behold, a white horse, and he that sat on him had a bow, and a crown was given unto him, and he went forth conquering and to conquer." In his writings, Aleister Crowley would refer to Antichrist as the crowned and conquering child, the Lord of the Eon. Standing with their backs to the wall is a key phrase in this song. Some researchers believe it denotes the mass murder of those who refuse to worship the New Age Christ. Standing with their backs to the wall, awaiting execution.
And ultimately, that's where all this is leading. I mean, it's all about peace and love on the outside. But when it all comes down, there's going to be a brutal leader that will emerge, who Crowley was forthright enough to talk about in his books, and talk about this bloodbath that would come, wherein Christians would be put to death in the establishment of the New World Order.
But is this merely the radical view of a drug-crazed Satanist like Aleister Crowley? Or is there, as many suggest, a global effort at work? We remind the viewer that the 20th century is without question the bloodiest in man's history. Some 170 million lives were lost to Nazism, communism, and the various killing fields of the world because of the darkness in the hearts of men. The Bible warns that the heart of man is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? For out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, including murder. Next, we turn to the town of Elberton, Georgia, the granite capital of the world. Elberton is famous for its production of tombstones, exporting some 250,000 tombstones every year. Oddly enough, the town that makes a living through death is also the home of what some consider the most threatening monument in America. A monument that some believe is a symbol for the coming Holocaust, promoting a depopulation effort at a massive scale.
It was back in 1979 when a stranger came to Elberton, Georgia. Now, Elberton, Georgia is on the eastern part of Georgia, very close to the South Carolina border. And this stranger said that he was part of a secret group, and they wanted to build a great granite monument.
This was done by a guy who gave a pseudonym, came in, paid cash, had this company set these things up in 1980, called himself R.C. Christian, but that's not his real name. It says it right on the stones, a pseudonym.
Nobody knows his real name because that isn't his real name. Nobody knows who put the money up other than this fictional individual. Nobody knows what secret group he represents. Of course, Elberton mines granite. They make tombstones there. And they had the facilities to mine the granite. But he gave very, very specific directions as to how this was to be built, so that it would always be aligned in certain ways, so you'd always be able to see the North Star, so it would be aligned with the moon and with the various phases of the sun. And very, very similar to the Stonehenge that they have in England. So as the Stonehenge was a Druidic monument, this was to be the American Stonehenge, or it's known as the Georgia Guidestones. And on each one of the Guidestones is this message in a different language, actually 8 different languages, are the 10 commandments that come from the dark side. And the first one is maintain the world population at 500 million in constant balance with nature, which doesn't sound too bad until you realize that we've got over 6 billion people in the world. And if we're going to maintain the world population at 500 million in constant balance with nature, we're going to have to kill off about 90% or more of the world's population.
I went there and looked at those things and said, now, hold on a minute. Today's population is 6 billion. They want to maintain humanity under 1/2 billion. Looks like a lot of people got to die for their plan to work, which is, by the way, the plan. Jacques Cousteau said we'd have to eliminate 350,000 people a day. 1/3 of a million people a day would have to be eliminated to save Mother Earth. Bill Clinton said we need to reduce the population of the Earth to 1 billion. There are a lot of folks who would like to reduce the population of the Earth.
Aleister Crowley taught that a global massacre would be necessary to bring about the New Age. He wrote, "There is a magical operation of maximum importance, the initiation of a new eon. When it becomes necessary to utter a word, the whole planet must be bathed in blood. Before man is ready to accept the law of Thelema, or will, the great war must be fought. This bloody sacrifice is the critical point of the world ceremony of the crowned and conquering child as Lord of the Eon. This initiation takes place to remove